Hi everyone. I'm having little questions here and there about some of the work that you're doing with the articles that you chose to read. I'm hoping that this might clarify what we are trying to move toward through the progress of these different activities that you've been working on over these first couple of weeks. So I'm going to kind of walk you through the process of what you're trying to accomplish with your articles. So you chose an article to read. Right now, we are not reading it entirely for content. I mean, you are reading it for content because you're looking at the writer's claim. But what we're not doing right now, just to clarify, is responding to the author's ideas and the topic. Right now, we're analyzing the article for how the author created their argument. So let's take a look at this a little bit more in detail. So the first thing you did was choose an article and read through it, right? Then you took with section 2.3, identifying the author's main claims, you took notes on the different claims the author made throughout the reading. So for this paragraph, this is the claim they're making. In this paragraph, this is the other, this is the claim of value that they argued. This is the claim of policy that they argued. You broke the piece down into its different sections and looked at all the different claims the author made. Then, with section 2.4, you read through those notes and you looked at all of those different claims, and reading through them, you tried to identify, if I put this all together, what seems to be the main overall claim of the whole article? What's the big picture argument the author is making that they want us to take away from reading this piece? So that's what you're working with then moving forward, is that this is the big overall argument of the whole piece. So once you've been able to identify that, then in section 2.5, you have that overall claim. Now you go back to those margin notes and see what were some of the most prominent claims or reasons the author gave that you feel really help support that main overall idea. And that's what you were identifying here. Once you're able to identify some of the subclaims or reasons that help support the big overall claim or argument, then you want to go back and see whether or not the author has addressed any counter-arguments, other perspectives on this topic, and how they addressed those counter-arguments. Did they offer a rebuttal to them, and what did that look like? To wrap everything up, you go back through one more time and see if there are any limits the author placed on their argument. And I'm going to talk about each one of these below here. Okay, so here's the first part. You read your article and you start identifying claims, even with the title, right? Why wouldn't we all cross the border? Well, they're making a claim of fact. We would all cross the border. That's what the author is saying, right? And that's what this student picked up when they were reading the article. Here's another section of the article the student read. All the disagreements over immigration policy I have been hearing about in the news lately reminds me that while I believe in the rule of law, I feel profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of keeping people out who are desperate to come in. Is illegal immigration actually wrong? Is it unethical to cross a border without permission? So the student, when reading this, picks up the idea that, this author seems to be suggesting a claim of value, that it might not actually be wrong to cross illegally. And maybe also kind of offers another claim of value, that the rule of law is right. Is this a contradiction? So the student is trying to figure it out. Now, this is a much shorter version of the table than what's in your textbook. As you may recall, this goes on for some time, and all of you will have tables that are much longer than this, because all of the articles have several claims that are made. But I gave you just a shortened one so you could kind of see what we were working with and reminding you of what that section was all about. So the student goes on to demonstrate that the writer that they were reading provided a claim of policy about the border, that they provided a claim of fact, and then again the table actually goes further. So again, as I mentioned above, once you have all of these notes, you can go through, contemplate all of these claims that you've identified, right? And then that's where you move on to decide the main claim. Okay, great. When I read all of that, what seems to be standing out the most? What consistent or repetitive arguments do I see being made? When I look at all of these claims together, what does it seem to add up to? And that's going to kind of basically provide your overall argument that the author is making. And considering these questions that were posed in the textbook can also help you as you're reading through those margin notes. What does the writer seem to want us to believe? What does the writer most want to convince us of? What do they keep kind of harping on? That kind of lets us have a clue as to what exactly it is they're trying to argue. Where is this writer going with this? If the writer had to make their point in just one sentence, what would they say? That's a big one, because that's going to be really helping you identify the claim and then later sort of use that in your summary. All right, so if we take that the example from the textbook using this table above, the student decided that the overall argument was that border policy should not criminalize undocumented immigrants. That's what they felt was the overall idea that the author wanted to get across, and if the writer had to make the point in just one sentence, this would be the point they would make. So this is going to be the claim that the student works off of as they continue to analyze the article. So after have identified the big overall claim, now you move into finding the reasons that support that claim. So you can go back to your table, look at some of these other pieces that you pointed out and see which ones, especially if it's repeated more than once, which ones, really seem to be the major reasons that support that main claim that you identified here. And then you're going to want to kind of pull them out, those few, so that you have them ready to talk about them when you start to talk about how the author has created their argument. Now, in the next section, you were to look for the counter argument and the author's rebuttal to that argument. So you want to be looking, does my author address some kind of counter argument? Now, let me give you a hint. All of those articles contain at least one counter argument. But what I want to kind of warn you of is authors don't necessarily say or write, one counter argument is, and writers don't necessarily come out and say, hey, there's this whole other view. They're going to be a little more subtle than that. And counter arguments aren't necessarily, it's not necessarily a black and white. Like it's like I believe in this, they believe in the total opposite. Sometimes it's much more subtle than that. So that's why in your textbook, let's see if I can bring that up, provides different ways that counter argument might be framed. Writers may use phrases like, it's a popular misconception, or some have fallen for the idea, or many people mistakenly believe. Some will take issue. Others have claimed that, right? So these are different ways to set up a counter argument without saying a counter argument is. Sometimes it comes through things like, I do concede. We must admit that. I acknowledge that. So these are ways of identifying a counter argument and addressing it. So in the student example from the textbook, the writer used the phrase, I admit. So that's a great example of one of those subtler phrases that means that they're going to summarize a valid point, which kind of goes against their main argument, but it's a valid point. So in the case of the textbook example, the author writes, I admit that completely open borders would put our security at risk. That is an issue. She admits that. And then they typically will address or offer a rebuttal showing the flaws of the counter argument or showing another perspective or way to consider things. And again, our textbook provides examples of this, the ways in which an author might phrase it. Something like, this idea misses the fact that. And while I might concede that it's a valid point, I disagree with it because, or this argument overlooks something. Again, we can admit that part of this is true or that it's valid and still believe in these other things. So there's lots of more subtle ways authors might frame their rebuttal. So you'll want to be looking for that. And then last but not least, you look for the limitations. I think this one kind of stumped people just a wee bit. So basic limitations mean most of the authors are not going to say, this is always the way it is in every single circumstance for every single people. They're usually going to limit what they're talking about. In this case, the piece that the student is reading, the author makes this claim. If most of us under desperate circumstances would cross the border without permission and feel no moral qualms about doing so, then we must recognize this crossing as an ethical, reasonable act. So where she's limited is right here with this phrase, under desperate circumstances. She's not saying all immigrants. She's saying immigrants under desperate circumstances. She's limited the population she's talking about in her argument. So that's the kind of thing that you'll be looking for in your own readings. So sorry this video is a little long, but just to recap, you read through the article, then you took your margin notes on your author's claims throughout each of their paragraphs. You read through those notes in different claims to form what seems like the overall main idea, which you have all submitted. Once you know what that overall main claim is, you use those margin notes to help identify the reasons. And next we see if the author addressed any counter arguments and offered a rebuttal to them. And then lastly, did the author place any limits on their arguments? They're not making the grand claim that all things, all people, in all times, right? That they're kind of limiting that. Now, all of this information is going to later come together when you go into section 3 this weekend and start working on a summary of your piece, or at least a one-sentence summary. And keep all of this in mind when you look at the student samples that you are going to be looking at this weekend, because these are the student samples of the essay that you are going to be writing next week. So sample summaries, what's great about these is when you open up the sample papers, they provide guidance in the margins of what is happening, what the student has done in these different sections of the paper. Pay super big attention to this because this is to be a model for you. You should be seeing how the student author has constructed this, and this is like a template almost for you. So I hope that helps. All right, I hope this was all a little bit helpful for everybody. Kind of get you in the right frame of mind moving forward. And let me know if you have any questions. Have a great weekend.